Hey everybody, it is Dean Z speaking to you from the University of Michigan Law School on a kind of a rainy day, but we need the rain, so it's really good. I hope the lighting is good and I look at my best. If not, it's Dustin. Trust me, in real life I'm amazing. Okay, today I want to talk to you about writing an addendum, or in its plural, writing many addenda as part of your law school application. What the heck is an addendum? We ask you for lots of information in the application, but maybe there's some piece of information that explains something in your application or that just doesn't fit anywhere naturally, and that's a great place for an addendum. So the place that everybody needs to use an addendum is if they check yes to the misconduct question, which we talked about last week, and then you need to explain what happened. So that's one kind of addendum. I'm not going to talk about that again because I just talked about it. But there are many other uses for addenda that could be very helpful in telling your story for an admissions committee. So I wanted to dive in to a couple of those. And I was inspired because we got a lot of really great questions that all are touching on some aspect or another of using addenda. So let's dive in. Okay. Got a question from two different people, Aiden S. and Caleb T., about what crosses your mind when you see that an applicant has transferred between undergraduate institutions and or switched majors. Would you like to see something like this addressed in addenda? That's a great example of a time where I can see that someone has transferred. It's obviously not like a giant piece of the puzzle, but I'm always curious, right? Like, oh, you went to that school, now you went to this, transferred to this very different kind of school. Why? Sometimes it's obvious, right? Like, so if you went to, some people will start out at a community college and transfer to a four-year college. I don't need an explanation of that. I think it's great, I love it, but you don't need to explain it. But if, say, this is an actual example, say you went to Bryn Mawr for undergrad and then you transferred to University of Texas. Real story, because Bryn Mawr is my undergrad alma mater, and I saw this, and I was just curious, what made you transfer from Bryn Mawr to Texas? And I emailed the person to ask, and I now don't completely remember what she said. I know she didn't like Bryn Mawr, which I get, because even though I loved it, it was a tough kind of place. So anyway, she explained it. I admitted her. She's an alum. She married another alum. Happy ending. So I don't know. Is that a story about how you should write an addendum, or is it a story about how you should wait for me to ask? It's a story about why to write an addendum, because I might not always ask, right? I think I only felt bold enough to do it because it was Bryn Mawr and I was familiar with it. But yeah, so if there's some element of your story that might raise a question, and there's no obvious place to tell me about that, that's a great use of an addendum. What else? Putting that aside because there's more written on there that I may need to return to. Okay, moving on. Gerald W. Talks about having done ROTC in college, which was a huge time commitment, and he says it's part of why he doesn't have work experience during college because there are weekends and summer trainings, and it just really affected what he was doing in college. And he said, should I write an addendum about it? And this one could go either way, because there is actually a place where you can include this information, and that is your resume. So you could put on your resume, you should put on your resume that you're a member of ROTC, and you can talk about what you did there, and you can you can show the times that you participated. So if it was in a summer, that will show why you didn't have a job, because you were doing ROTC that summer. And you can also give me some sense of how many hours a week that you spent doing it during college, and that would, if it's 20 hours a week, I'm going to understand that you are not going to also be a varsity athlete or be, in 5 different extracurricular groups or whatever it is, or have a part-time job. So you could put it there, but if for some reason you felt like that wasn't adequate, sure, you could definitely explain that in an addendum. Relatedly, Tiffany M., who, by the way, said hello to Dustin in addition to me, so Dustin's thrilled about that, I can tell. She mentioned that she is working full-time, but also caring for her parents, both of whom have chronic illness. And she wanted to know if she should include that as in some place in her application, and she mentions the resume. And I have seen people mention caretaking roles on their resume, but it's a little funny. It's not quite the same as a job, particularly when it's for a family member. I mean, if you're caring for someone as part of a job, that's different. But if you're caring for a family member, I don't know, it sometimes feels like a weird tonal switch between, XYZ job, also caretaking for my mom, which is, has an emotional resonance to it that is just different. So that seems like a great place also to use an addendum, where you're saying, this is how I've been spending my time in addition to work, and it explains why I'm not doing other things that you might think I would be doing in addition to working. And Tiffany also said that she was worried about mentioning it because she was worried that an admissions reader would have doubts about my commitment to law school if I'm also currently in this caretaking role. And that is a great point, and that's another reason for putting it in an addendum where you can explain it. So I do sometimes see, if I see someone has a particular connection, like a family thing that seems to be keeping them in one area, I think, how would they ever come to Ann Arbor if they're so tied to Southern California or whatever it is? So if that is not the case, if I would be drawing the wrong conclusion from it, you could explain that in the addendum, why if I were to be admitted to Michigan and to attend, my brother Pete would step into my role in the caretaking or whatever it is, right? So I think you are right to be thinking in those terms, and an addendum would allow you to explain why that is the wrong conclusion for someone to draw. I will say though, if it is the right conclusion, if it would be very hard for you to go to whatever school you're applying to, and you want to apply anyway just because you don't know, then maybe I wouldn't mention the caretaking, right? Because I do think that is a question that will get raised. So smart, Tiffany, to be thinking of all the angles there. Another example of a good use of an addendum is when you want to explain something about your undergraduate record. So J.K., that's funny, it's J, last name begins with a K. J.K., sorry, asks that I had one semester where I took a lot of pass, no pass courses, and it was because some of them were required. I had to take them pass, no pass. And then there's a long explanation for other reasons he took pass, no pass. And he just wondered, is that something that someone would notice? Yes, it is. And so having a 2-sentence addendum about, I took 47 pass no pass classes because 45 of them were required, and 2 I was just taking these classes that aren't really in my field and I just wanted to experiment with them, or whatever it is. That's a great use of an addendum. Explaining anything about your undergraduate record that isn't otherwise obvious, that might help us, might help us be assured that your academic preparation is what it should be. Another time this might come up is if you have a lot of W's for a particular reason, withdrawals, or you just had one terrible semester, or maybe your whole undergraduate career wasn't the greatest for whatever reason, and you have something you can point to. Even if it's just, honestly, I was immature and I have taken some time and now I'm ready. That giving context for anything in your application that might otherwise be perceived as a weakness, great use of an addendum. J.K. also asks about using an addendum for LSAT scores, like if he took it 2 times and one time, had a much higher score than another. If you have something that you can articulate that is clear and persuasive, yes, by all means, do that. So let's say it's, I was taking the LSAT at the University of Michigan and the marching band was practicing and marched outside my room for half an hour and it really distracted me, or I was taking it online in my home and there was a lot of problems with the proctor, or whatever it is, you should definitely say that. But if it's more, often people don't have an explanation. It's sort of like, I don't know, the first time maybe I was nervous, or the second time I wasn't, or whatever it is, then you don't necessarily have to say anything. But think about it. If there's something that you want to say that you think would be persuasive, you can do that. But now I'm going to take a little left turn here and put a footnote, because Jay asked about 2 different possible addenda, LSAT and GPA. And at some point, if you're writing more than one addendum, it becomes weird looking, for lack of a better word. It attracts its own sort of notice. And it looks like you have an explanation for everything, and nothing is as it seems. It just creates a sort of a sense of there is a lot to unpack here, and I feel like everything in this application has some backstory, and I don't quite understand what's happening. I have a friend at another school who says, it makes her suspicious, like people are trying to cover things up, and she's a very suspicious person, so seems very bad to her. I think that's a fair point. I don't quite feel exactly that, but I see where she's going with it, and I assume other people have similar reactions. So be cautious about your use of addenda, and don't overdo it. Only use it for the things that you feel really need some explanation and for which you can point to something solid to say. Okay? Here's another one that has to do with working. It makes me think a little bit about the caretaking question, but this one is for someone, or the ROTC question. This is for someone who worked full-time in undergrad. This is coming from Mark M., who says, how would Michigan consider full-time work experience that was done during one's undergrad? And he did a lot of different things. He'd worked as a manager for a retail company, he'd worked as a courtroom assistant, etc. Really took up a lot of his time. And I think that does not require an addendum, though, because I think that would be easy to make pretty evident on a resume. So you'd say, you'd show the job, and then, as I said, you can put hours in parentheses to give some context of how long you were doing something. Here you'd say, worked full-time during the academic year. So, don't make it a mystery. Make sure that everybody is very clear who's reading it, exactly how hard you were working and exactly what was taking up your time. But I don't know that it's necessary to write an addendum. However, maybe there's a particular reason. I would assume you're doing this because you need to earn money to pay for school. But maybe there's some other reason why you were working full-time that you feel like is going to add helpful information, helpful context again to your application, in which case maybe then an addendum makes sense. But if it's simply to show what you were doing with your time, I don't think an addendum is necessary there. And of course, that will be, of course we want to know this. We want to know that you're working full-time. That's helpful context, but it doesn't need to be explained in a separate setting, I think. Here's a question that came in from John P. prior to our last episode that was about misconduct. And John P. is asking about an incident of misconduct in his own life where he did something wrong and he learned from the mistake, and so he's asking, how do you talk about that? Last episode, I'm not going to talk about that in detail because I really covered that a lot already, but he specifically says, it seems incredibly difficult to make the main aspect of your personal statement be about your own personal failure. So I'm going to pretend this isn't an episode of misconduct where he actually got charged with anything. Maybe it's just something that's really weighing on him that he wants to explain. And then, again, shed some light on the rest of his application. I agree. Writing in your personal statement about something that is all negative isn't usually a great way to present yourself. You're trying to present the most positive picture of yourself. Now, arguably, he says here that he learned from it, so maybe it could be a great personal statement because he's telling this positive story of what he learned. But if that's not how he feels, maybe just talking about it in an addendum would be the right way to handle it, so that you can leave the focus of your personal statement for some totally different topic. And maybe you don't need to talk about it at all if it wasn't something that you were charged with, which it's not clear from this email whether it was. Okay, here's a good one. On your law school report, you will notice that you have both a degree GPA, the GPA that you get from the school that you graduate from, plus a cumulative GPA, which is the GPA if you attended more than one college level institution. So they may be different. If you just went to one school the whole time, they will be the same. But if you transferred, or if you took a summer course somewhere, or whatever it is, they may be quite different. If they are quite different, you should know that the cumulative GPA is the one that a school will look at. And usually, when they're quite different, the degree GPA is higher than the cumulative GPA, because usually it's like someone had a rough beginning and they transfer somewhere and then they're happier and they do better. So it's a shame because that degree GPA is good, but that's not the one we are going to be looking at most closely. We look at the cumulative because that's the one that we have to use in constructing our medians. So it can be very helpful. Again, this is just helpful context, like what happened here? Why is there such a difference? It may be evident elsewhere in your application, but if it is not, that's a great use of an addendum to explain, why they are significantly different and why you think the degree GPA, even though it's not the one we're going to use, is actually the one that is reflective of your ability. I should say too, not only should you shouldn't just say, I think this one's better. You need to show it. So don't have this unsupported statement. Often people will say that. They'll say like, please look at this. It's a better indication of who I am, and not that. It's like, why? Why is that a better indication? You got to support your argument there. It doesn't need to be elaborate, doesn't need to be a full legal brief, but give me a couple sentences about why you think this is more compelling than not. Okay. Now we're wrapping up. I think this is the last one. This is from Mark H. And he writes to ask, how much does undergraduate institution ranking or prestige matter for a non-traditional student with a good deal of experience after graduating? And he explains why he happened to go to what he calls a relatively weak undergraduate institution more than 10 years prior, like why it made sense for him at the time, but and was the right decision for him. But he wants us to know why he didn't choose a different type of school. On the one hand, I don't think that's necessary. Like, I love to get people from all kinds of schools, and honestly, there are a million different reasons why people start out at, what might be, a non-Ivy League school, and end up at a law school that is, a Michigan or some other similar school. There's all kinds of reasons for that, and it generally is not something that I think I need answered. But maybe you have something that is particularly compelling or that you really just want to make sure the reader is focused on. Again, an addendum is a great place to put it. There's no other way really to explain that. In this case, I don't know that it's necessary, but if you want to do it, that's what an addendum is for. Finally, I was doing a little workshop today, and we were talking about addenda, and John S. asked a great question about what's the difference between, making an excuse in an addendum and having a real explanation or a positive reason for something. And I thought that was a really great question. And I don't know that my answer is really great, but I think it really comes down to tone, right? It is, when you're writing it, do you feel like you're being, kind of whiny? Do you feel like you are being, or do you feel like you're being straightforward and matter of fact? Do you feel like you are complaining, or do you feel like you are shedding light on something, right? Think about, what is your motive? What is your tone? What is the overall message of what you are saying? Because John S. was absolutely right in his intuition that you don't want to just be, making an excuse. You want to be giving us information, showing us who you are, but don't just, give me an excuse. All right? I hope that is helpful. I think this is a really important topic that really gets sort of short shrift in, in most of the admissions discussions that I'm part of. So I hope that you find this useful. There's a whole extra category of things that could be an addendum that I'm not going to touch on here. I'm going to save that for a future episode about disabilities and so forth. So stay tuned for that. But for now, I'm going to wrap this up and say thank you very much for watching. Now for grammar. And I love Dustin. I love Dustin. But I'm going to have to name and shame a little bit here, because the other day he sent me a little note to ask me, there's a question about stationery, like writing material. And he spelled it with an A, station, A-R-Y. There's two kinds of stationery. There's stationery where you're still, not moving, you're stationary, or there's the stationary that you write nice note cards and so forth. That one is spelled with an E, and that's the one Dustin meant, but he used an A. So because I'm kind of a pain in the ass as a colleague, I immediately texted back to be like, you mean with an A. I don't think he'll ever forget it. Maybe we won't be friends anymore. I don't know. I hope we've moved on from it. But the way I learned to remember the difference when I was in elementary school, a teacher told me the E, you remember like write has an E at the end. So if you're talking about writing, use the stationary with an E in it. I don't know. It stuck with me, so maybe that's useful to you. And that way you can avoid annoying colleagues correcting you. Yeah, hope that helps. All right. Thanks as always for watching or listening. Please leave your comments below or send us an email to law.jd.admissions@umich.edu. Thanks as always to Dustin, who puts up with me in more ways than can be counted. And wherever you go, go blue.